With high unemployment, poverty, despair, and alcoholism rampant on most reservations, the government realized that the reservation system was a costly failure. Some officials felt that the problem was that the reservation land was owned by the tribe and not by individual Indians. This was the way Indians had always owned land. It was believed that if individual Indians could own their own land, they would have the incentive to farm it and raise livestock on it, as whites did. In response to growing support, the U.S. Congress passed the General Allotment Act in 1887. Under this law, each Indian head of family would be given 160 acres to do with as he wished. At first, many Indians were puzzled and amused with the whole idea of being given land that was rightfully theirs to begin with.
What we don't like about the government is they're saying, we will give you this much land. How can they give it when it is our own? We cannot understand it. They have never bought it from us or our forefathers. They say now they will give us so much land, our own land.
The amusement turned to outrage when the Indians learned more about the Allotment Act, and one feature in particular. Once the land was parceled out to individual Indians, the land that was left, in some cases as much as 90% of the original reservation, could be acquired by the government for sale to white homesteaders. So while the act was presented as something that would benefit Indians, it actually benefited whites.
The real aim of this bill is to get at the Indian lands and open them up to settlement. The provisions for the apparent benefit of the Indians are but the pretext to get at their lands and to occupy them. If this were done in the name of greed, it would be bad enough. But to do it in the name of humanity, and under the cloak of an ardent desire to promote the Indian's welfare by making him like ourselves whether he will or not, is infinitely worse.
The fact was that the General Allotment Act was just another land grab, another scheme to take Indian land.
In that 1887 Act, it busted up tribal holdings and took all of the tribe's land away. It was a huge land grab. It stole land. Each individual under this piece of legislation, the General Allotment Act, got 160 acres per male, per Indian male at the head of the household. And the women didn't even get any land. Only the men that would get land. And that was a violation of our Indian treaties, because you can't just simply, wipe out millions of acres without consent. So it was taking without compensation, and that's unlawful. So that was a real sad chapter in Indian history. Between those years of 1887 and 1934, we lost over 90 million acres of land that was stolen from Indian country.
As it turned out, the General Allotment Act, which was intended to bring Indians into mainstream America, was a failure. Few Indians had either the desire, the experience, or the equipment to farm their land, and most wound up leasing or selling their land to whites at bargain prices. About the only thing the act did achieve was what most Indians had feared, a further loss of Indian land. Surplus Indian land was advertised for sale on posters and in newspapers throughout the country, starting a land rush in nearly every western state. White homesteaders streamed into Indian country. Teepee villages were replaced by ranches and farms. Entire towns sprang up overnight. The West was completely transformed in just a few decades. In states like South Dakota, the General Allotment Act and others like it helped contribute to a steady erosion of Indian land, so that by the early 1900s, the once vast reservations that spanned the entire state were reduced to a patchwork quilt of small, isolated reservations. The Indians were caught between two worlds. They didn't have enough land to continue living in the old ways, and they didn't have the education or training to pursue lives elsewhere. In the 1950s, the government encouraged Native Americans to leave the poverty of reservation life and relocate to the nation's cities, where they would receive 1 month's training and a good job.
The relocation program was an effort on the part of the government to move Indians into urban areas and off of their reservations. They promised lots of things. They promised training programs and they promised jobs. Indians were moved to places like Denver, Minneapolis, Cleveland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. But the problem was that there was very little training and even fewer jobs.
While a few Indians were successful in making the transition to city life, most of them wound up living in the same sort of poverty they had hoped to escape on the reservation. What's worse, the Indians faced prejudice in the cities from people who didn't want them there.